Now, in case you were unaware, James White is one of the most lauded among Calvinist teachers. The man's been teaching Calvinism for, close to 30 years or maybe right around that. He has defended Calvinism against such teachers as William Lane Craig, Leighton Flowers, and much like R.C. Sproul and J.I. Packer, once again, he's very respected. But he's saying right here that Satan, as well as Judas, has no true autonomy.
Satan is not only a creature of God, but his role in his sovereign decree has already been laid out, just as clearly as Judas's has been laid out. And so there is no reason to talk about satanic autonomy or to even assume satanic autonomy.
For all of you not in the know, autonomy means, in the Western ethics and political philosophy, the state or condition of self-governance, or leading one's life according to reasons, values, or desires that are authentically one's own. In other words, Satan, Judas, nothing, not even a molecule, has true free will to do anything. God decrees and ordains all things that comes to pass. He actually makes them come to pass, just as he decrees them. Now, that's the teaching of Calvinism, but let's look at one instance of Satan right here, and we can easily prove that Satan truly has his own free will. In Job chapter 1, verses 6 through 12, we read this: "Now there was a day when the sons of God," that is the angels, "came to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Doth Job fear God for nothing? Hast not thou made a hedge about him, and about his house, and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, all that he hath is in thy power. Only upon himself put not forth thine hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord." Now, obviously, I'd like for you all to observe these highlighted parts. First of all, "And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou?" Why would God ask this if he decreed Satan's every action? Now, to know every action that Satan was going to do, just like God knows all the things that Adam and Eve were going to do, how they were going to fall, yet he still asks, Adam, where art thou? He's just getting a confession out at that point. But whenever God is the one whom is, like Calvinism teaches, whenever God is the one in whom forces everything to come to pass just as he wills, it makes absolutely no sense to ask this of someone in whom you are moving like a puppet everywhere. And now, look at the second highlighted part. "Hast not thou made," now this is Satan talking, "hast not thou made a hedge about him?" Why would God feel the need to protect Job with a hedge like walls around him? Why would God feel the need to protect Job if he completely controlled every action of the enemy? Couldn't he just make the enemy not come near Job? There'd be absolutely no need for walls or protection of any sort. And now for the third and last highlighted part. "And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, all that he hath is in thy power." How can anything be truly within the power of Satan if he lacks genuine autonomy? But notice the follow-up line right here, "Only upon himself put not forth thine hand." Now this tells us a tremendous amount about how God really has the devil and evil people on a leash, but they do have true free will. Satan has genuine autonomy, but like a dog on a leash is only allowed to exercise such freedoms within the confines set by the Lord. I totally agree with John 17 Apologetics in their response to James White's video, because it's been getting tremendous backlash on X Social and all throughout the internet whenever he wrote, "So we have, as Calvinists claim, invested ourselves in the veneration of human autonomy because we think people can believe the gospel. Meanwhile, James White has invested himself in the total degradation of God's holy character by laying 100% of the acts of Satan at God's feet. And nobody bats an eye. Once that you get within one of these systems that boxes you in and doesn't allow Scripture to lead you, you're actually forcing Scripture into a box, a man-made box. And now we see this with Calvinism. And it's a horrible atrocity that has been perpetuated. James White also said this: Satan's role in God's sovereign decree has already been laid out, just as clearly as Judas's has been laid out. Well, just as we looked at an example of Satan in Scripture, now let's look at an example of Judas in Scripture.
His sovereign decree has already been laid out, just as clearly as Judas's has been laid out.
Well, let's just look at the very words of God himself on the earth at the Last Supper, right before Judas betrays him. Jesus said, "Woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed," speaking of Judas. "Good were it for that man if he had never been born." In other words, better if he had never been born than to betray Christ. I ask you this, my dear friends, why would God in the flesh mention a better scenario for his betrayer if he was the one who had forever decreed Judas's every action? This makes no sense unless Judas was doing something of his own autonomy, his own free will. Clearly, both Satan and Judas had true autonomy in these situations, but did exactly as God knew, not forced, they would do. The lack of self-awareness is stunning within the logic of Calvinism. Here's a somewhat recent meme from Calvinism whenever they're making fun of anyone in whom thinks that people have genuine free will, and we find a contradiction within one of their own memes. The meme states at the very top, "God would never violate your free will." Now, they're making fun of us in whom we stand up for the fact that humans have true autonomy. And we'll find the contradiction within this if you haven't already spotted it. Now, observe the example that they give at the very bottom of this meme. I guess when God turned Nebuchadnezzar into a wild beast for 7 years and forced him to live in the field with animals, it was because Nebuchadnezzar chose to do that first. In the 4th chapter of the book of Daniel, the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, had a dream of a giant tree that symbolically covered the world. The tree, which represented Nebuchadnezzar, his kingship, his pride, was then cut down. And it was cut down by the decree of an angel from heaven. Whenever he said, let Nebuchadnezzar's heart be changed from man's, and let a beast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him. And most of you already know the whole account. Nebuchadnezzar calls all the wise men in. They can't give him the interpretation of the dream. And then he calls Daniel in. Daniel tells him that this means that Nebuchadnezzar will be cut down, if you will. For 7 years, he'll be abased and become like a beast. It was God cursing him for 7 years because of his pride. It's then that we read in verse 29, at the end of 12 months he walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. The king spake and said, is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty? While the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven, saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee, and they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times 7 years shall pass over thee, until thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. From the same hour and over the next 7 years was Nebuchadnezzar given the mind of an animal. He would go about eating grass, living outdoors, etc. Now that you know the whole account, let's come right back to the meme. Calvinists used Daniel 4 to illustrate God's sovereignty over all things. First off, no one denies that God can and at times does violate the free will of certain people in order to bring about God's greater purposes. So the very thing in which Calvinists are accusing us of being wrong in, that God would never violate someone's free will, hardly anyone claims that. Now, there are a fringe group that does claim that, but that is not our stance.
Now, the problem is Yahweh plainly violated Nebuchadnezzar's free will in Daniel chapter 4.
Once again, the complete lack of self-awareness is blatant among these Calvinists. Why would Calvinists ever dare to claim God violates anyone's free will. Remember, they say God controls every single movement of everything. Leighton Flowers of Soteriology 101, he constantly has these online back and forths with James White, and he writes this about James White. And the memes comment right here, hey, James White, what is there to violate if God decrees whatsoever comes to pass? Are you saying God violated what he himself decreed for Nebuchadnezzar to will? Such contradictions are rampant among Calvinists, leading most of us to wonder if they even understand their own system. And I find this constantly with Calvinists. I had an exchange just a little while back, a couple of weeks ago, with a Calvinist, and he said, well, what God does and what we teach, he was a Calvinist, he said, what we teach is that God, he knows that every evil act is going to come to pass and he allows it. And I wrote back to him and I said, oh, then you're not a real Calvinist. Just drop the title and you're set, because that's what we believe. It is either ignorance of Calvinism's actual tenets or worse, a complete disregard for biblical truths to uphold the system itself. Remember, they forced the Bible into their own little box, which leads so many Calvinists into obvious inconsistencies. Once again, one of the most quoted and highly regarded among all Calvinists was R.C. Sproul, and he said this, when God promises us that he will forgive us, we insult his integrity when we refuse to accept it. Leighton Flowers, once again, he found the stunning contradiction right here. You insult people's intelligence and bring into question God's integrity when you insist all are born by his decree, only able to refuse it unless he supernaturally causes them to accept it. Once again, John 17 Apologetics. If Calvinists were consistent, they would recognize that everyone in hell never actually rejected the gospel. They were all born dead, meaning dead in trespasses and sins. They were unable to call out to Christ. They're unable to understand the gospel unless God first regenerates them, according to Calvinists. They can't just hear the gospel and believe of their own free will. They must be forced to believe. It's called irresistible grace. They were all born dead, so they can't accept or reject it, because dead means dead, but they aren't remotely consistent, speaking of Calvinists, and they're really not. My dear friends, do pray for all of those under this cult-like system of Calvinism. The more that I learn about it and the more that I learn of what Calvin actually taught, the more I just wage war against it. I can't bear this system. And there are so many in whom believe it, but they don't actually teach it. For years, I sat under one man in whom he was a 4-point Calvinist. I had no idea that he was even a Calvinist, let alone a 4-point. He told me the only reason that he wasn't a 5-point Calvinist was because he didn't believe that God would send babies to hell. And I said, well, that's a pretty good line to stop at, because there are many Calvinists in whom believe that God just any, many, mighty mo's all creation, because it's unconditional election. There's nothing that you can do or your neighbor can do that makes him choose you or him to go to heaven or hell. He just decrees it. And in case you think I'm making it up, that certain Calvinists, believe that God would send newborn infants into the fiery lake of fire and brimstone for all eternity and torment them. This is what Jonathan Edwards, he's one of the most respected of all Calvinists, and he wrote this, "It is most just, exceeding just," he says, "that God should take the soul of a newborn infant and cast it into eternal torments. This is a cult that must be eradicated from our Christian teachings, my dear friends."